Case 1. Ana Trujillo. Texas. A Houston jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was guilty of murder. The sentence was life in prison. And the central piece of physical evidence submitted by the prosecution was a blues stiletto shoe with a 4.5-inch heel that the Harris County medical examiner had matched. Through forensic wound analysis, to the injuries sustained by the victim, Alf Stefan Anderson. Ana Lilia Trujillo was 45 years old at the time of her arrest in June of 2013. Alf Steph Anderson was a 59-year-old research professor at the University of Houston. The two had been in a relationship for several months and had spent the evening of June 8th, 2013, at a jazz club in the Museum District of Houston before returning to Anderson's condominium at the Museum Tower. By the early hours of June 9th, Anderson was dead. When Houston Police Department officers responded to a 911 call at the condominium, they found Anderson on the floor of his apartment. Trujillo was present at the scene. She told responding officers that she had acted in self-defense, that Anderson had been intoxicated, aggressive, and that she had used the shoe to protect herself during a confrontation. The responding officers documented her statement and the condition of the scene. And the case was transferred to homicide detectives. The forensic examination conducted by the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office became the evidentiary foundation of the prosecution's case. Dr. Dwayne Wolf, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, testified at trial regarding his findings. The examination documented approximately 25 to 30 puncture-type wounds, concentrated on the head and facial region of the victim. The size, shape, and distribution pattern of those wounds were consistent. Dr. Wolf testified, with repeated contact from an object shaped like the heel of the shoe recovered at the scene. Blood spatter analysis conducted by crime scene. Investigators provided additional context for how the events in the condominium had unfolded. The analysis of the distribution patterns, locations, and characteristics of the blood evidence was presented to the jury as part of the prosecution's reconstruction of the sequence of events. The defense strategy centered entirely on the claim of self-defense. Defense attorneys argued that Anderson had a documented history of aggressive behavior when intoxicated, and that Trujillo had been in genuine fear for her safety when she used the shoe during a physical confrontation. Character witnesses testified to Anderson's behavior on prior occasions. The defense framed the case as one in which a woman in a dangerous situation took the only action available to her to protect herself. The prosecution's response to the self-defense argument focused on the forensic evidence. Prosecutors argued that the number of wounds, their concentration in the head and facial area, and the pattern documented by Dr. Wolf were inconsistent with a single defensive act in the heat of a physical struggle. The forensic testimony established, in the prosecution's framing, a pattern of repeated contact over a sustained period, a distinction that the prosecution argued undermined the self-defense claim. Jurors heard testimony over the course of the trial from law enforcement officers, forensic experts, character witnesses, and individuals who had known both the defendant and the victim. The 911 call placed by Trujillo was played for the jury. Photographs documenting the crime scene and the condition of the apartment were submitted into evidence. The shoe itself was submitted as a physical exhibit. The jury of Harris County citizens began deliberations and returned guilty of a verdict in under 3 hours. The speed of the verdict was noted by legal observers as an indication of the degree to which the forensic evidence, particularly Dr. Wolf's wound pattern testimony, had resolved the central factual dispute in the case. Judge Maria T. Jackson presided over the sentencing phase. Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison, with parole eligibility available after 30 years. Under Texas law, the jury in a first-degree murder case determines the sentence. The jury's decision to impose life rather than a fixed term reflected the totality of the evidence and the circumstances presented during both phases of the trial. The case has since been referenced in academic and legal contexts for two primary reasons. First, the forensic methodology applied by the medical examiner's office, specifically the wound pattern analysis and the matching of wound characteristics to the physical dimensions of the recovered item, demonstrated how object-specific forensic analysis can be applied to unconventional weapons. Second, the case raised, in a publicly visible forum, the legal and evidentiary standards that govern self-defense claims when the only surviving account of a fatal confrontation is that of the defendant. Trujillo's attorneys pursued post-conviction appeals. The appeals courts reviewed the trial record, including challenges to the jury's decision process and to certain evidentiary rulings, and affirmed the conviction. As of the most recent publicly available records, Ana Trujillo remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Case 2, Lori Vallow Daybell, Idaho. On June 9, 2020, investigators executing a search warrant on a rural property in Salem, Idaho, recovered remains buried in separate locations on the grounds. Forensic examination subsequently confirmed that those remains belonged to two children: Joshua Vallow, who was 7 years old at the time of his death, and Tylee Ryan, who was 16 years old at the time of her death. Both children had been missing since September of 2019. Their mother, Lori Vallow Daybell, had told investigators she did not know where they were. Lori Vallow Daybell's path to a courtroom in Ada County, Boise, Idaho, in the spring of 2023 began with a welfare check. In November of 2019, Rexburg Police Department officers attempted to verify the welfare of Joshua and Tylee after relatives, specifically members of the Vallow family, contacted authorities with concerns. When officers spoke with Lori Vallow Daybell at her home in Rexburg, she told them the children were in Arizona with a family member. Investigators attempted to verify that account and were unable to do so. A court order was subsequently issued requiring Vallow Daybell to produce the children to authorities by a specific date. She did not comply. By January of 2020, she had traveled to Hawaii with her then-new husband, Chad Daybell, whom she had married in November of 2019. Approximately 2 weeks after the death of Chad Daybell's previous wife, Tammy Daybell, in Fremont County, Idaho, the investigation expanded to encompass not only the missing children, but also the death of Tammy Daybell. Tammy Daybell had died on October 19, 2019, at her home in Salem, Idaho. The death was initially attributed to natural causes, and she was buried. After the June 2020 discovery of the children's remains on the Salem property, investigators pursued a formal forensic review of Tammy Daybell's death. Her remains were exhumed and subjected to forensic pathological examination and toxicological analysis. The Fremont County coroner subsequently reclassified her manner of death. Cell phone geolocation data and tower records obtained through subpoena were critical investigative tools in the Vallow Daybell case. Investigators analyzed location data from the devices associated with Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell in the periods leading up to and immediately following the children's disappearance and Tammy Daybell's death. The digital location record placed individuals connected to the case near the same property sale events. During time windows relevant to the investigation, financial records examined during the investigation document the existence of life insurance policies and the flow of Social Security survivor benefit payments following the deaths. The Social Security Administration later pursued recovery proceedings related to payments made after Joshua Vallo's death to Vallo Daybell, who had continued receiving those payments while her son was, investigators concluded, already deceased. The ideological framework that federal investigators and state prosecutors identified in the case involved a set of beliefs held by both Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell relating to end times religious doctrines. Testimony and documentary evidence at trial, including electronic communications, indicated that the couple had applied those beliefs in ways that categorize individuals in their personal lives, including family members, as spiritually corrupted figures referred to in their private communications as zombies. The trial of Lori Vallow Daybell in Ada County began in April of 2023. The charges included 2 counts of first-degree murder relating to the deaths of the children, 1 count of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder relating to the death of Tammy Daybell, and additional charges including grand theft. The 7-year-old child died. The 16-year-old child died. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, digital communications, financial records, and testimony from individuals who had known the Vallow and Daybell families. The jury convicted Lori Vallow Daybell on all counts on May 12, 2023. Judge Stephen Boyce sentenced her on July 31, 2023, to 3 consecutive terms of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Chad Daybell was tried separately and convicted in 2024. He received a sentence of death. Case 3, Michelle Troconis. Connecticut, on May 24, 2019, Jennifer Farber-Dulos dropped her children at school in New Canaan, Connecticut. She never returned home. Her body has never been recovered. What investigators did find: across a stretch of Albany Avenue in Hartford, in a series of garbage bags, was physical evidence, including items bearing biological material consistent with Jennifer Dulos's blood, and footage from surveillance cameras along that Albany Avenue corridor captured who was disposing of those bags. Michelle Troconis was the girlfriend of Fotis Dulos, Jennifer's estranged husband at the time of Jennifer's disappearance. The couple had been engaged in contentious divorce and custody litigation for years prior to May 24, 2019. That legal history and the financial pressures documented within it formed a significant part of the prosecutorial framework in both the case against Fotis Dulos and the case against Troconis. Connecticut State Police conducted the initial investigation into Jennifer Dulos's disappearance in coordination with New Canaan Police. The forensic examination of Jennifer's New Canaan home identified biological material consistent with blood and established through analysis of that evidence that an incident requiring a Class Lonix law enforcement response had occurred within the home. Evidence collection at the scene was documented and preserved for subsequent forensic analysis. The Albany Avenue surveillance footage became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the Dulos investigation. Video footage from cameras positioned along that commercial corridor in Hartford captured a vehicle matching the description of a truck registered to Fotis Dulos's company and captured individuals disposing of garbage bags in multiple trash receptacles over a period of several hours on the evening of May 24, 2019. Investigators canvassed the route, recovered the bags, and subjected them to forensic examination. The bags contained items including a sponge, towels, and clothing items that forensic testing identified as bearing biological material consistent with Jennifer Dulos. License plate reader data collected by surveillance systems along the Albany Avenue area corroborated the video timeline and assisted investigators in reconstructing the movement of the vehicle in the relevant time window. Cell phone location data was analyzed and submitted as part of the investigative record. The digital location evidence provided investigators with additional tools for establishing, the whereabouts of individuals connected to the case during the hours relevant to the investigation. Fotis Dulos was arrested and charged with murder and kidnapping. He died by suicide in January of 2020. Before his case reached trial, Michelle Troconis was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, evidence tampering, and hindering prosecution. In the evidence tampering and hindering prosecution components of the case, prosecutors presented evidence including a document referred to at trial as an alibi script. A written document prepared with the assistance of Troconis according to the prosecution's case, intended to establish a false account of Fotis Dulos' whereabouts on May 24th. The existence and contents of this document and Troconis' alleged role in its preparation were central to the charges related to hindering prosecution. Troconis' trial began in January of 2024 in Stamford, Connecticut, before Judge Kevin Randolph. The prosecution presented the surveillance footage, the license plate reader data, the forensic findings from the Albany Avenue bags, the biological material analysis from the New Canaan residence, the cell phone location data, and the alibi script document. The jury convicted Troconis on all counts on March 1st, 2024. On May 31st, 2024, Judge Randolph sentenced Troconis to an effective 14.5 years to serve, structured as a 20-year sentence, with execution suspended after 14.5 years of incarceration. The broader Dulos matter is connected to Connecticut's passage of a coercive control statute, commonly referred to as Jennifer's Law, in 2020. Which expanded the legal definition of domestic violence in Connecticut family court proceedings to include patterns of coercive control. Case 4, Karen Reed, Massachusetts. On the morning of January 29, 2022, Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found unresponsive in the snow outside a home on Fairview Road in Canton, Massachusetts. He died. The question of how that happened and who was responsible became the subject of 2 separate trials, a national debate about police investigative integrities, and one of the most closely followed fates in Massachusetts proceedings, Maya's Ape Shoes, in Massachusetts history. Karen Reed was O'Keefe's girlfriend. She was charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence, and leaving the scene of a fatal collision. The prosecution's theory was that Reed had struck O'Keefe with her Reese SUV in the early morning hours and left him outside in sub-freezing temperatures. The defense's theory was that O'Keefe had been assaulted inside the Canton home, which belonged to individuals connected to the Boston Police Department, and that evidence had been mishandled or deliberately placed to implicate Red. Physical evidence examined during the investigation included fragments of a vehicle taillight recovered near where O'Keefe's body was found. Forensic analysis of those fragments was conducted to determine whether they matched the taillight assembly of Reed's SUV. Accident reconstruction experts were retained by both the prosecution and the defense and their analyses produced competing conclusions about the source and cause of O'Keefe's injuries. Cell phone data became one of the most contested evidentiary battlegrounds in the case. Investigators examined health application data on O'Keefe's phone, specifically step count data by the phone's built-in motion sensors, and presented an interpretation of that data regarding movement recorded in the early morning hours. The defense presented competing expert analysis of the same data. The digital forensic methodology used to analyze and interpret smartphone health application data was scrutinized extensively by both parties and by outside digital forensics professionals who reviewed the publicly available proceedings. A Google search recorded on a device connected to the case. A search entered in the early morning hours of January 29th, relating to cold exposure, was submitted as evidence and disputed by both sides as to its timing, origin, and significance. The first trial, conducted before Judge Beverly Canone in Norfolk Superior Court, ended on July 1st, 2024, when the jury reported it was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Judge Canone declared a mistrial. A second trial was ordered. The retrial of Karen Reed concluded on June 18, 2025. The jury acquitted Reed of second-degree murder, acquitted her of manslaughter while operating under the influence of alcohol, and acquitted her of leaving the scene of a fatal collision. She was convicted of operating a motor vehicle under the influence of alcohol. Judge Canone sentenced Reed to 1 year of probation. The Reed case produced substantial public and institutional discussion regarding the handling of the initial investigation, the role of digital forensic evidence in criminal proceedings, and the legal and procedural standards governing how law enforcement agencies investigate cases in which other law enforcement personnel are involved. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office conducted a separate parallel inquiry into aspects of the investigation. Case 5, Corey Richens, Utah. On March 4, 2022, Eric Richens died at his home in Kamas, Utah. He was 39 years old. The Summit County Medical Examiner determined that the cause of death was a fentanyl overdose. Toxicological analysis of post-mortem samples found a fentanyl concentration reported to be several times a lethal dose. Eric Richens had no documented history of fentanyl use. His wife, Corey Richens, called 911. The initial investigation by Summit County law enforcement examined the circumstances of Eric Richens's death. The forensic toxicology findings, specifically the concentration of fentanyl documented in the post-mortem analysis, and the absence of any history or evidence of prior fentanyl use by the decedent, prompted investigators to look beyond a simple overdose explanation. The investigation expanded and was pursued over the following year. Digital forensic evidence played a central role in the investigation. Investigators executed search warrants for electronic devices and accounts associated with Corey Richens and examined the internet search and browsing history documented on those devices. The search history, according to materials submitted in court proceedings, included searches related to fentanyl and its effects. The forensic recovery and analysis of that search history, including examination of the dates and times of individual searches and their relationship to the timeline of Eric Richens' death, was submitted to the court as part of the investigative record. The investigation also examined a prior incident. Prosecutors alleged that on February 14, 2022, approximately 18 days before Eric Richens died, Corey Richens had attempted to cause his death by placing fentanyl into a drink she prepared for him on Valentine's Day. That alleged prior incident formed the basis of a separate charge of attempted criminal homicide, in addition to the primary charge of aggravated murder relating to the March death. Financial records and documentations regarding Eric Richens' estate and any life insurance policies associated with him were examined as part of the investigation into possible motive. The financial circumstances of the Richens household, and any disputes between the couple relating to financial matters were documented in investigative materials and referenced in charging documents. In May of 2023, Corey Richens was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, attempted criminal homicide, and multiple counts of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. A separate set of charges relating to alleged financial crimes against Eric Richens' estate was filed in related proceedings. Following her arrest, it emerged that Corey Richens had, in the months after Eric's death, completed and published a children's picture book titled Are You With Me?, framed as a grief resource for children who have lost a parent. The fact of the book's publication and its content was widely reported. In a subsequent development, investigators alleged that Corey Richens had attempted, from jail, to communicate with a potential witness through an intermediary in a manner intended to influence that witness testimony or cooperation with the investigation. That conduct produced an additional allegation referenced in proceedings as the so-called walk to Aspen communication. As of the most recent verifiable reporting from this review, the Richens case had not reached a final verdict. Proceedings had experienced scheduling adjustments. The Summit County 3rd District Court docket should be consulted for current case status, any plea entered, and any trial outcome or sentence imposed. Case 6, Varsha Sabnani, New York. This case falls outside the primary 2000 and 18 to 2024 window of this documentary. It is documented here as the most fully verified federal case on record looked in the United States involving a female employer convicted of serious crimes against live-in domestic workers. Investigators, prosecutors, and federal judges involved in this case described it at the time as one of the most significant forced labor prosecutions the Department of Justice had pursued. It is presented here in its factual entirety for that reason. Varsha Mahender Sabnani and her husband, Mahender Murlidhar Sabnani, lived in a large home in Muttontown on Long Island in the state of New York. They operated a business in the fragrance industry. Beginning in approximately 2002, the household employed live-in domestic workers. Two of those workers, Indonesian nationals, were the subjects of the federal investigation that led to the Sabnanis arrest and prosecution. The investigation was conducted by federal agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement in coordination with the Department of Justice. It was initiated following the escape of one of the domestic workers from the Sabnani home. Law enforcement officers who responded to a call encountered the worker and observed her physical condition, which was documented in the law enforcement report. The worker's condition prompted an immediate investigation. The second domestic worker was subsequently removed from the home. The federal grand jury indictment against the Sabnanis charged them with forced labor, involuntary servitude, conspiracy to commit forced labor and involuntary servitude, harboring aliens for financial gain, and document servitude. The unlawful retention of the worker's identity and travel documents. Trial evidence presented by the prosecution included testimony from both workers about the conditions in the Sabnani household. the nature of the work they were required to perform, the restrictions placed on their movement communications. On their movement and communication, the food and rest they were permitted, and the conduct of Varsha Subnani toward them. The legal standard for forced labor under federal law. Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1589, requires the government to prove that the defendant is used force, threats of force, physical restraint, a scheme of serious harm, or abuse of legal process to compel a person to provide labor or services. The evidence presented at trial was assessed by the jury. Against that legal standard, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both defendants in December of 2007. United States District Judge Note Platt sentenced Varsha Savnani to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Mahender Sabnani received a shorter sentence. The court additionally ordered restitution to be paid to the victims, with reported amounts in the range of $1 million. The case was handled by the Eastern District of New York and is cited in federal human trafficking enforcement literature as a foundational prosecution under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act enforcement framework. Enforcement Framework. Case 7. Nancy Brophy, Oregon. On the morning of June 2, 2018, culinary instructor Daniel Brophy was found at the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland. He had been shot. He died from his injuries. His wife, Nancy Crampton Brophy, reported him missing after he failed to return home and was later informed of his death by Portland Police Bureau officers. Within the investigation that followed, prosecutors would eventually argue that her own published writing had documented something important about her state of mind years before her husband died. Nancy Crampton Brophy was a self-published author of romance novels. In 2011, she had published an essay on a writing website with the title How to Murder Your Husband. The essay discussed, from the perspective of a fiction writer, various methods by which a fictional character might kill a spouse. Multnomah County prosecutors sought to admit the essay as evidence at trial. Judge Christopher Marshall ultimately ruled the essay inadmissible. The prosecutions built its case on other evidence. Portland Police Bureau detectives assigned to the case pursued the investigation over an extended period. Nearly 4 years passed between the June 2018 offense and the 2022 trial. The investigation identified several categories of evidence that formed the prosecution's case. Surveillance footage from locations along the route between the Brophy's Portland home and the Oregon Culinary Institute recorded a vehicle consistent with the description and appearance of a vehicle Nancy Brophy had access to, at times relevant to the morning of June 2nd. The footage was analyzed and presented evidence of her presence in the area around the time the incident occurred. Ballistics evidence was submitted regarding the weapon used in the shooting. The investigation into the weapon's origin produced evidence of a particular significance. Investigators documented that Nancy Brophy had made purchases through online retail channels of components associated with the assembly of a firearm, specifically a slide and barrel unit compatible with a Glock-style pistol. Components that, when combined with other parts, could be used to assemble what is commonly referred to as a ghost gun, a firearm without a manufacturer's serial number, and therefore not traceable through standard firearms registration systems. The documentation of those online purchases, the items ordered, the dates, the delivery addresses, was submitted as evidence. The prosecution also presented evidence regarding life insurance policies held on Daniel Brophy's life and the financial circumstances of the Brophy household, including evidence of financial pressures that prosecutors argued established a motive for the conduct charged. Nancy Brophy's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the prosecution had not met the burden of proof required for a murder conviction. The trial, which began in April of 2022 before Judge Christopher Marshall in Multnomah County Circuit Court, concluded on May 25, 2022. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on the charge of second-degree murder, Judge Marshall sentenced Nancy Brophy on June 13, 2022, to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Post-conviction appeals were filed. The Brophy case has been referenced in firearm policy and legal contexts as an example of how online purchase records for firearms components, including components sold individually for ostensibly legitimate purposes, can be traced and submitted as evidence in criminal proceedings. Case 8, Susan Lawrence, Florida. On June 2, 2023, Ajiki Owens, a mother of 4, was killed outside the front door of a home in a residential neighborhood, in Ocala, Marion County, Florida. She was standing outside when she was struck by a bullet fired from inside the home through the closed front door. The person who fired that shot was Susan Louise Lawrence, her neighbor. The neighborhood dispute that preceded the shooting had been ongoing for a period of time prior to June 2, 2023. According to law enforcement and court records, the dispute primarily involved the presence and conduct of Owens's children in the common areas near both properties. Marion County Sheriff's Office had received prior calls related to the dispute. On the evening of June 2nd, Ajiki Owens went to Lawrence's front door. Exactly what prompted her to go to the door on that occasion, and exactly what was said or done at the door, was addressed through witness testimony at trial, including testimony from Owens's children, who were present. Susan Lawrence, from inside her home, fired a round through the closed front door. Owens was struck. She died from her injuries. Lawrence was not arrested immediately. In the initial period following the shooting, Lawrence, or her representatives, indicated she was considering invoking Florida's Stand Your Ground law as a legal defense. Florida's Stand Your Ground statute, codified in Florida Statute Section 776.012, permits a person who is in a place they have a lawful right to use force, including deadly force, without a duty to retreat if they reasonably believe such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another person. Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods, addressing the media in the days following the shooting, stated publicly that his office had reviewed the circumstances and concluded that the Stand Your Ground standard had not been met in this case. Lawrence was arrested on June 5, 2023. 3 days after the shooting, the charges filed against Lawrence included manslaughter with a firearm, culpable negligence, assault, and battery, the latter 2 charges relating to prior alleged conduct during the neighborhood dispute. The manslaughter with a firearm charge under Florida law carries a potential sentence of up to 30 years in prison and a minimum mandatory term under Florida's 10-20 life sentencing statute. Evidence presented at trial included the physical condition of the front door, specifically the bullet hole and the trajectory it documented, ballistics analysis of the round, 911 call recordings made on June 2nd, and witness testimony from individuals who had been present at the scene, including Owens's children. The testimony of the children regarding occurred in the moments before and at the time of the shooting was addressed during trial proceedings. Trials proceedings. The trial was conducted before Judge Robert Hodges in Marion County Circuit Court. The jury returned a guilty verdict on the manslaughter with a firearm charge on August 16, 2024. On November 25, 2024, Judge Hodges sentenced Susan Lawrence to 25 years in prison. The case drew national attention and was cited in ongoing legislative and policy discussions regarding the scope and application of Florida's stand your ground law, particularly in neighbor dispute contexts where the precise nature of the threat and the reasonableness of the fear claimed by the courtrooms by a ground law person using force become central factual questions for the jury. Closing narration: 8 cases, 8 courtrooms, 8 verdicts reached through the work of investigators who examined wisdom digital records, analyzed forensic evidence, social, and followed the facts wherever they led. The common thread across all of them is not the nature of the crimes or the identities of those charged. It is the investigative process itself. Toxicology reports, surveillance footage, online purchase records, cell phone location data, forensic wound analysis, health application data, court-documented testimony. These are the tools that built each of these cases, and these are the tools that placed which of these before juries of American citizens who evaluated the evidence and returned their verdicts. If this documentary gave you something to think about, leave your thoughts on as comments below. We read every single one. If you are not yet a subscriber, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and make sure you don't miss what we publish next. And if you found value in this video, share it. It is the single most powerful thing you can do to help this channel keep producing work like this. This is The Crime Whisperer. We will see you in the next one.